The Salvation Army has always given tremendous importance to its local officers. Whilst it is true that the Salvation Army has depended for the over 100 years of its existence upon the quality of dedication of its officers, it's equally true to say that the quality of dedication of its local officers has been crucial to its success in times gone by. Now, we believe that the future of the Salvation Army is going to depend upon the quality of dedication of the local officers of today. And for that reason, training is being given the kind of importance it deserves. Now, it's not really surprising that the Salvation Army has given local officership this kind of central importance. After all, the founder of the Salvation Army was a Methodist minister brought up in a Methodist situation who was accustomed to the old-fashioned but tremendously effective Methodist system of class meetings. Perhaps you know the system. The class meeting in the Methodist Church was quite a simple affair. What happened was, if you had, say, 100 members in the Methodist Church, you divided them up into 10 classes of 10 members and appointed over the class a Methodist class leader. Now, the class leader was chosen for his leadership qualities and his depth of spirituality. And he was placed over the small group in a position of leadership and shepherding. Now, in the outside world, he might be merely a layman, a laborer of no great significance. But in the class meeting, he was a man of tremendous significance, a man to whom the class members looked for guidance and direction. And it was not unusual in those days, when Methodist was in its primitive stage, for the class leader to be a laborer and the class member to be a factory owner or an aristocratic gentleman. Within the class situation, leadership depended upon spirituality and spiritual experience. Now, with that kind of background, when William Booth began his Salvation Army, it's not really surprising that he gave to lay people within the ranks of the Salvation Army significant tasks and great significance. Now, the founder of the Salvation Army was a clerical-minded gentleman. He believed that the clergyman should lead and that the layman should follow. That was the tradition in which, as a young man, as a member of the Anglican Church, he had been brought up. But he quickly learned, as experience came to him, that lay people had a tremendous amount to contribute to the life of his growing Salvation Army. On one occasion, for example, he was preaching, and I suppose he was having an off day. He wasn't getting through. Every preacher who has ever stood behind the pulpit knows what it's like to sometimes feel that he's not reaching his audience. And it was like that on this particular occasion for William Booth. And in desperation, he wondered what he could do. He wasn't getting the message of God's love, God's immemorial love over to the congregation. What could he do? In desperation, he looked down, and in the front row of his congregation, there was a gypsy man who'd been converted, a matter of a few weeks. And he signaled to him and said, "Come up here, friend, and say something to his congregation." And the gypsy, who never stood in a pulpit in his life before, stood behind the rostrum and began to speak. Spoke from his own experience of his new beginnings in the Christian life. And the audience was suddenly spellbound and gripped. And when he went home, William Booth said, "Well, I know what I've got to do. I've got to tear up all my sermons and go in for the gypsies." Now, I don't think he actually did that, but he certainly got the idea that a layman with deep spiritual experience had a leadership place in the Salvation Army. Now, the difference, perhaps, in his attitude was this. Let me explain. I belonged for a while, for 2 years in fact, to the British Army, the military army, and I soon learned that in the military situation there are officers and non-commissioned officers. Officers were regarded as something very important, and there were the other ranks, as they were described, officers and other ranks. When the Salvation Army under William Booth decided it should have local lay leaders, it decided not to have this kind of separation of officers and other ranks, but rather that there should be officers and local officers. You see the subtlety of the difference, I hope. Of course, in many churches, the layman is allowed to hold some position of importance. But who has ever heard of a local priest? The Roman Catholic Church has priests, of course, but it doesn't have priests and local priests. Churches may have pastors, but not local pastors. Fathers, but not local fathers. But in the Salvation Army, the lay leadership is regarded as equally significant as the officer contribution. So we have officers and local officers. The officer has to be mobile, has to be moved from place to place, but the local officer stays in his town, in his community, and fulfills his ministry, perhaps over a long period. And in the eyes of the Salvation Army, his ministry, and I choose my words very carefully, his ministry is as valuable as the ministry of him who we like to call the commissioned officer. Now, what is the value of the local officer to the Salvation Army? Well, he has tremendous value. Let's try and summarize his contribution to the strengths of the religious denomination which we call the Salvation Army. First of all, he helps to establish continuity. One of the problems when you move officers about from place to place, as we do in the Salvation Army, is that the army can suffer, if we're not careful, from what we call stop-go. Stop-go. What I mean by that is that an officer arrives who is deadly enthusiastic about youth work, and everything goes on youth work. There's an enthusiasm for it, dollars are spent on it, the program expands, and then the officer is removed to another appointment. And another officer comes in who doesn't care very much for youth work, hasn't the time or the patience to spend on youth programming, and he decides that what's important is community service, and we must look after the down and outs in our community, and he ignores youth work altogether, and so the youth work almost stops, and we all go mad about social service, and we open all kinds of accommodation for the homeless, sandwiches for the hungry, social work of every possible description, and so one stops and the other starts, and then after him comes another kind of officer who can't bear social work, gives it no importance at all, but thinks that the services to the aging have tremendous significance, and so we all go mad on social services to the aging, and the ordinary social services are lost and the youth work is forgotten. You see what I mean? Because of the change of leadership of commissioned officers, the work of the corps can be damaged by what I call stop-go, stop-go. If there is in the corps a group of consecrated, committed local officers, they can establish a continuity in the midst of all this change. The thinking of the local officer might go something like this. Friends, as he talks to the other people of the corps, friends, we now have a leader who has a different emphasis. While he is giving strength to that particular emphasis, it's our duty to retain some kind of emphasis on the other programs so that the youth work isn't neglected while we give emphasis to the social activity, for example. Continuity is one of the valuable things which the local officer can add to the corps. Another reason why I'm so enthusiastic for local leadership and why the Salvation Army is giving it renewed emphasis is because the Scriptures place great stress upon the variety of gifts. Within the body of Christ, which we call the church, or in Salvation Army parlance, the corps, I believe that God has given everything that that community needs. It has, within its corporate grouping, every possible gift it needs. The local officer system is a system that can use this variety of gifts. One man has a gift for sharing sympathetically with those going through times of bereavement, disappointment, or loss. He brings his gift to the group. One man has a gift for organization. He adds his gift. Another man has a gift for finance, or for fundraising. He brings his gift. So in a group of local officers within the corps, all the different gifts that are required for the health and strength of that corps are present. The system of local officership, then, is an attempt, in good stewardship sense, to harness the different resources represented by the variety of gifts of the people present. A third reason why the local officer has tremendous importance is that he can provide, if he's of the right quality, if his service is of that kind of quality that God can smile upon, he can provide role models for the young people within the community of the corps. Many young Christians are confused because they have no role models to follow. What is a committed Christian? How should a totally committed Christian act? What should be his involvement? What should he be giving? How should he be acting? In a well-structured corps, where local officers are in position, the young people of the corps have someone to relate to. They look at the life of a dedicated, committed local officer fulfilling his functions in the corps for the edification of the total group, and they can see the role model they need to follow in that person. And fourth, and perhaps even more significant function for the local officer is that he can give strength to the commissioned or commanding officer. No commanding officer, be he ever so capable, ever so dedicated, ever so clever, can combine within himself all that is needed for the ministry of that corps. If you have the Archangel Gabriel himself appointed to your corps, you can be grateful, but I can tell you he will not have in his one person all that is needed for the leadership of that corps. And the commissioned officer, though he be an exceptional man, needs to be surrounded by a group of people whom he can trust and with whom he can share the terrifying responsibility of ministry to that corps. The dedication, and you've heard me use that word many times, the dedication of the local officer is of first significance and importance. He can't be a casual part of the corps life. He has to be a committed person. And so his dedication must be marked by certain things. One of these is regularity. Supposing he is commissioned to lead let's take for example, to lead the band in a particular corps. He can't be casual about that. If Tuesday night is the band rehearsal night, he can't say, well, I won't bother to go this Tuesday, I've got a bit of a headache, or there's a good match on television, I just won't bother to turn up. If he is a local officer, his commitment to the program for which he's responsible must be complete, so that there will be about his service a regularity, a come hell or high water attitude, which says whatever happens, I'll be there, making my contribution, adding my 2 cents, leading the group for which I'm responsible. There's a regularity about his leadership, which is very, very important. Let me digress for a moment and talk about a person I know. For example, when I was a little boy, and I mean a little boy, perhaps 3 or 4 years of age, my father, who was a corps commanding officer all his life, was stationed in a little country village in Lincolnshire in England. And he must have preached a particularly good sermon, because at the end of the sermon, when he made the altar call, down the aisle came his 3 or 4-year-old son, that was me, making his way to the altar to commit himself to Christ. I suppose it was the first time I made any kind of commitment to Christ. There have been many times since, but here I came. Now, my father was very rarely short of words, but for once he must have been thunderstruck to see this family response to his call to commitment to Christ. As I knelt at the altar, I can remember very clearly, although I was very young, that next to me knelt a beautiful Salvationist, an elderly lady, she must have been in her 60s, an elderly lady who was the young people's sergeant major. She was responsible for the young people of the Corps, their teaching and their training. She knelt beside me, she put her arm around me, and she talked to me about the love of Jesus, who could help me to be a good boy. She was so sincere. I'll never forget the way she spoke to me and the nearness of the presence of Christ I felt at that moment. Now the years passed, and I became a Salvationist myself, and a Salvation Army officer, and eventually a divisional youth secretary, from which high and exalted position it was my duty to visit certain corps in the area to which I was appointed. And strangely, I was appointed to the Hull and Lincolnshire division of the Salvation Army. Imagine my surprise in my mid-30s as a divisional youth secretary when I came one Sunday evening to visit the corps, the Wainfleet Corps, the little village corps where my father had been stationed all those years before, and to preach the Sunday night sermon. And as I got to my feet in that beautiful little hall, I was thrilled to see on the front row, sitting in her accustomed place as if 30 years had not passed, Mrs. Hasnett, the retired young people's sergeant major, now in her 90s, immaculate in her uniform. And I thought as I looked at her, if a 4-year-old child wants to pray at the altar tonight, Mrs. Hasted is still there to speak to him about Jesus. Hers was no flash-in-the-pan dedication. The regularity of her dedication proved its depth. Now, it isn't only regularity, of course, that has to mark the service of a local officer. It's not only regularity, but quality, which must be the hallmark of his contribution. Quality. What's the point of being there every time there's something to be done if what you're doing is of second-rate quality, casual, unprepared, as if it was of no real significance? No, if you undertake any kind of local officer position in the Salvation Army, you need to remember that the quality of what you're offering must be the best that you can offer. It means that you must be prepared for the task, whatever that task may be. Oh, some years ago, I visited a corps in England where I was an officer at that time, and they said I should meet the primary sergeant. And I inquired who the primary sergeant was. The primary sergeant is that local officer who's responsible for teaching the under-8s, the little kids in the Sunday school. And they said, oh, we've got a very imposing primary sergeant. So I met the primary sergeant and discovered that the primary sergeant was a commissioner in the Salvation Army, which is the highest rank that any officer can hold. And I said to him, because it was Commissioner Orton, I said to him, Commissioner, you are the Chancellor of the Salvation Army worldwide. You are responsible for the financial problems of the Salvation Army in 86 countries. How do you find time to teach the primary kids in Sunday school? Well, he said, I make time. It means that I must spend, together with my wife, because we work at this project together, at least 2 evenings a week to prepare for the primary Sunday school class. Well, I looked at this great Christian leader in the Salvation Army and his gracious American wife, by the way, and thought, here are 2 people, no longer young in years themselves, who feel it quite in order to dedicate 2 whole evenings a week to prepare to teach the truths of Jesus to little children under 7. So the quality of their service can be such as God can smile upon. The local officer has to dedicate himself expensively to his responsibilities. The local officer pays in time, in energy, in dedication. He invests himself. He pays, and the corps grows. One of the most important parts of a local officer's service is to serve on what the Salvation Army calls its census boards. What an unusual, what a peculiar name the census board is. For after all, it gives the impression that the duty of the board is simply to count the flock, to count the people. Nothing could be further from the truth. Unfortunately, I have very little influence internationally, but if I had, I think I would persuade the General to do away with the title Census Board and introduce the title Caring Committee. Because in actual fact, that's what the census boards of the Salvation Army are supposed to be. And the local officers that comprise those boards are in fact called to care. The function of the census board is to care for the flock. Now, one of the tragedies of the Salvation Army, and I have an idea that it may be a tragedy that is shared with many churches, is that its back door is as wide open as its front door. Let me explain what I mean. I mean that while we are making every effort to bring new people into our church, our core community, there are, at any given time, almost as many people, if not occasionally more people, leaving by the back door. We are bringing them in by the front and losing them by the back. Now, there may be a variety of reasons why so many people leave the church. But one of the reasons, I've got no doubt at all, is that the care, the quality of care, leaves something to be desired. There has to be, in order to maintain the health of the flock, regular and constant care. What a tragedy it is that people can drop out of our community without anyone doing anything about it. How tragic it is that in many corps there is no system to care for the people who may be passing through times of trial or trouble or doubt. No regular system by which the people who are drifting away can be gone after and brought back. Now, this is the duty of the census board local officer, not simply to count the flock, but to care for it. Some years ago, I was stationed in a large corps with 400 members and fine congregations. And I went to see, because I missed him from his usual place in the congregation, a man called Mr. Savage. And I discovered he was in hospital. I knocked at the house of his neighbor and discovered he was in hospital. So I went to see him in hospital. And I said to him in his hospital bed, Mr. Savage, I'm so sorry you're ill. I've come to pray with you and to minister to you in the name of the Lord. But tell me, how long have you been coming to our corps? How long have you been part of our Sunday morning congregation? Oh, he said, something like 10 years. 10 years, I said, that's great. We're so glad that you belong to our church. Now, I went back to the corps, and the next Sunday morning, as I stood up to preach, I said to the congregation, friends, this week I've been to see Mr. Savage. There was a kind of a blank look came over their faces, and I realized that immediately that very few people in the congregation knew who I was talking about. I said, you know, Mr. Savage, he always sits over there on the right-hand side. He hardly ever misses Sunday morning. Mr. Savage, you know. There was still that blank look on the faces of my regular members of the congregation. And then I did what I shouldn't have done, really. I was young and perhaps a little less wise than I am today. I said to the congregation, challenging them, look, would you put your hand up, please, if you know who I'm talking about? I'm sorry to say that not one single hand was raised in that congregation of 300 or 400 people. That's sad, to feel that someone can attend regularly, even make some contribution to the life of a congregation, but nobody is caring for him. Now, what should happen at a census board meeting? Basically, it's quite simple. There may be 50 names, 100 names, 500 names on the roll of that particular corps. The local officers, let me pause to stress it correctly, the local officers of the corps sit around and discuss each name one by one, talking about that person's health, their contribution to the corps life, their spiritual condition. And if it should be that there is some question or need of care, then one of the local officers elects or volunteers to go particularly to care for that person. Now, obviously, the Corps commanding officer has his own program of shepherding and caring, but the local officer commits himself to caring for the flock in this way. He feels responsible for the person who is in need. In that way, the back door is not quite so wide open, and less people leave the church. Now, what came out of the problem of Mr. Savage is quite easy to explain. We decided that in that particular corps, we would bring out what we would call a directory of soldiers. And in that directory, we would place the name, the address, and the telephone number of everyone associated with that corps, be he a soldier, a recruit, an adherent, or simply a friend. His name would be catalogued in the directory, and his address and his telephone number, and every member of the congregation would be given a directory of soldiers, so that he would at least know the names of the people who belonged to the community of the church and take an interest in them. The telephone became a very useful thing in linking people within the church. Since I've come to America, I've discovered at least one corps where their directory of soldiers contains not only the name and address, but the photograph of the man or woman with their spouse and children, so that the member of the church can quickly identify his fellow members, and if he misses them or feels he can minister to them in any way, he knows the essential details that will help him to do it. Somehow or other, we've got to stop this drain of people away from the church or the corps community. The back door is still too wide open in most corps, and somehow we've got to close it. And the duty of the census board, the caring committee, is to close the back door. Of course, the local officer who is serious about his duties does not care only for that section of the corps for which he is particularly responsible. Supposing, for example, that you are appointed as the Home League Secretary of a particular corps. That is to say, you're responsible for the women's activities of that particular place. Now, obviously, your main interest will be a care and concern for the women of your program. And of course, your primary concern will be for their salvation, for their spiritual health and growth. That's your primary responsibility. But no one can be as parochial as that. No one who is truly a dedicated local officer can restrict his concern to those particular people or part of the corps to which he is particularly responsible. So the Home League Secretary, while she may concentrate upon the needs of the women in her program, takes an interest in the young people's work, in the community service aspects of the corps, in the other activities within the group, so that when the band of the corps is celebrating its birthday and holding some musical festival, which may or may not particularly interest the Home League Secretary, she finds her place on the front row and begins the applause. She backs the band, although she's not responsible for the band. And of course, when the Home League are holding some special event, the bandmaster is there to support. Our concern, our care overflows from our particular responsibility and encompasses things for which we're not directly responsible. The care of a local officer extends not only to those of his own section or the other programs in the Corps, but a good, committed local officer has a care for his leader. Now, as soldiers in a Corps, you expect your commanding officer to encourage you from time to time. When you get depressed, the Corps commanding officer is expected to put his arm around you and tell you that the world's not all bad and that you're appreciated. When you're going through a time of bereavement, you expect the Corps commanding officer to share and to sympathize with you in your loss. When your children have an accident, then you expect your commanding officer to get along to the hospital and to care for your children. Now, the kind of care which you expect from your Corps commanding officer as a local officer, you should be prepared to give. He gets hurt sometimes. He gets depressed sometimes. He gets discouraged sometimes. And one of your duties, your many duties, and aren't I making heavy weather of them, one of your duties is to care for your commanding officer, to encourage him, to ring him up sometimes and say, that was a good sermon on Sunday morning, Captain, it did our hearts good. To care for him. And sometimes even, just occasionally, to correct him. Just occasionally. I remember when I was a lieutenant in my first corps and thought I knew it all. I soon learned better, of course. I had a little problem. In the front of the hall, before the rostrum, there was a little silver vase. It was such a silly little thing, in my view, that it couldn't contain more than a couple of flowers. And as the congregation was liberal in its gifts of flowers to the church, it could never contain all the flowers that it needed to hold. And somebody was complaining about this to me, and I was the new lieutenant in charge of the Corps, and I said, oh, there's no problem, just simply remove the vase, put a bigger one there. There are plenty in the cupboard. And so I took the vase away and put another one there. Too late I discovered that this little silver vase was a vase with tremendous significance. It had been placed there by a member of the Corps in memory of his wife. And he didn't really appreciate my arbitrary change of the situation. And he took me to task about it. And because I was new, I suppose, and a little conscious of my position, I'm afraid I gave him short shrift and told him quite roundly that I decided what would happen in my Corps, and I didn't want his interference, and that the vase in question, whilst it may have been in memory of his wife, no longer served a useful function, and I really think he ought to be more polite when he spoke to his commanding officer, and I'm afraid I upset the old man dreadfully. The Home League treasurer overheard this unhappy exchange, and afterwards she called me to one side, and with great diffidence, taking her gloves to say it, she said, Lieutenant, you shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't have spoken to the old man like that. And just quietly she explained the significance again of the vase and how it meant so much to the old man because it was in memory of his wife, and that if I really wanted to make that change, I could have done it with more delicacy. And certainly my conversation with the old man had lacked something in Christian charity. She must have done a good job in ministering to me, because that evening I went round to see the old man myself and apologize for my behavior. But in that situation, the local officer ministered to the commanding officer. Part of your ministry as a local officer then will be to encourage and occasionally, just occasionally, to modify or to correct some of the more extreme behavior of a Corps commanding officer. This needs to be done, of course, with great tact and demonstrating Christian concern. One of the qualities we look for naturally in any local officer is the quality of leadership. He is expected to lead. In fact, one of the things which the Salvation Army seems most in need of in these present days is leadership at every level. And certainly this is true at the local level. We need people who will lead, who will be out in front, who will show the way, who will demonstrate how to do it, so that other people who may not have that quality of leadership will know what is expected of them and feel comfortable in responding to that kind of lead. So the local officer must be a leader. He must be capable of innovative leadership, taking the initiative, not always waiting for a command, being willing to go out in front and to show the way. I must confess that in my experience, I have always felt good about the local officer who wasn't afraid of me, was quite prepared to present a new idea to me and persuade me to implement it. Now, for something like 20 years, I've been an enthusiast for Christian stewardship. You may well ask, how did that happen? How did I get bitten by the Christian stewardship bug? So that now it's become almost an obsession with me. Well, it's quite simply that some 20 years ago, 22 years ago, I was appointed to a corps, and the corps treasurer, who was a chartered accountant, well qualified in his professional field of accountancy, he spoke to me once about something he'd seen in an Anglican church that emphasized Christian stewardship. I said to him that I didn't think it was suitable for Salvation Army purposes, but he persevered and he persuaded me. He talked to me, he gave me suitable literature, he discussed the topic with me so regularly that eventually he persuaded me to implement a stewardship program in that corps. And I discovered what can happen when people are willing to examine ruthlessly and realistically their stewardship of time and talent and treasure. And for the 5 corps that I commanded after that corps, I emphasized Christian stewardship to the benefit, I think, of the corps and of the kingdom. Eventually, just by the way, I became the National Stewardship Secretary for Great Britain. But who began this enthusiasm? It began, quite simply, by a local officer taking an initiative in a local situation. In actual fact, in that particular corps, though it's 22 years, as I say, since I was appointed to it, stewardship is still very much alive and is annually renewed, and the corps has grown steadily and continually all those years. But it was a local officer who took the initiative, led the way, persuaded and cajoled, and wasn't afraid to stick his neck out. I think of another situation. I was stationed in another corps, large corps, with many, many members, and I felt at that time that we were having a very good time and that the community was appreciating the Salvation Army and our church was growing. But one of the local officers asked to see me, and very carefully she proposed that we should extend our service to the community. I wasn't at all keen. I thought our program was quite adequate the way it was. But she persevered, and she offered to introduce herself a program for inadequate mothers. She was quite untrained for it, but she offered to go for training. And she established in that corps a weekly club, a Wednesday club, for inadequate mothers, with a ministry so beautiful that it reached out into the community and over many years has won people for Christ and demonstrated to the community what Christian concern is. But there again, it was not the initiative of the commanding officer. It was the imagination and the innovative thinking of the local officer that produced what is still now a beautiful program in that community. So we expect the local officer to lead in innovation. We expect him, of course, to lead in enthusiasm. Other people may think that the Salvation Army has had its day, not the local officer. He is convinced that the Army has a great future, and his own enthusiasm for the growth of the Corps and its service to the community is infectious. It affects other people, particularly the young people. Is there an open-air campaign? He's there. Is there a visitation campaign? He's signed on. Is there a list put up for more community service? His name is on it. He cannot be a wet blanket. Otherwise, whatever office he holds, his negative influence in the Corps will have a terrifying effect. His enthusiasm must be renewed by daily contact with his Lord. Without personal communion with his Master, his enthusiasm for what can be, from time to time, a repetitive task will wane and eventually disappear. The vertical communication is so vital if his horizontal communication is to remain valuable. The local officer as leader must lead also in sacrifice. In sacrifice, his dedication to the cause of Christ will be an expensive one. His contribution of time, his dedication of energy, his gift of money will demonstrate to the other members of the Corps what a Salvationist's commitment should be. He will lead in dedication, in sacrificial commitment, and most of all, he will lead in spiritual appetite. He may not be the biggest saint in the Corps, but he will be the saint with the biggest appetite for spiritual things, demonstrating by his attendance and support of any spiritual activity in the Corps that spiritual things are the first priority, and that whatever other programs the Salvation Army may introduce or proliferate, the spiritual growth of the individual and the salvation of the community is his first concern. This means that he will have a sense of responsibility for others. He will feel personally responsible for others. Supposing, for example, he's in charge of the boys' club. He will feel, if he is a good local officer, he will feel personally responsible for the spiritual health of every boy in his boys' club. He'll visit them in their homes, he'll remember their birthdays, he'll take them sometimes on trips, he will speak to them individually about spiritual things. He will teach them the things of God and, if possible, lead them to Christ. He'll feel responsible for that other person. If your appointment is that of Home League Secretary, you're responsible for the women's programs, your first concern will be the salvation of those women. You will feel personally responsible that every woman who comes to any of those program activities finds Christ. True, you'll want to have a colorful program. True, you'll want to have a good educational program, a good entertainment program. But your first concern will be for the spiritual welfare of those women. You will feel responsible for that and break your hearts until every woman on that program is converted and growing in grace. This sense of responsibility is what marks the true dedicated local officer. One of your other duties, and it's sometimes most difficult, one of your other duties as a local officer in the Salvation Army is to find your replacement. Now, one of the tragedies that I've seen as a Corps commanding officer myself is the way in which elderly local officers will sometimes hang on to office when they should give way to younger people. It is tragic to see a man in declining years who can no longer give that quality of service which local officership demands, and local officership is a very demanding business, hanging on to office beyond the time of his real usefulness and keeping out capable young Christians who have a great deal to give. As a local officer then, one of your duties is to find your successor and to train him. And immediately it is obvious to you or to others that the young man or young woman is better able to fulfill the office than you are, then you step quickly aside, offering perhaps to assist him, to act as his consultant, but giving the opportunity for other young people to enjoy the privileges of local leadership. Often the young people are capable of more responsibility than we're prepared to give them. One of our great international leaders, known to many of you, is Colonel Clarence Wiseman, General Clarence Wiseman, who was for some years the international leader of the Salvation Army, and as most of you know, is a Canadian. Now, Mrs. Wiseman is a gracious and capable leader in her own right. She has written many books and is a most acceptable speaker and has traveled the world in the service of Christ, and her ministry is hard to measure. How did Mrs. Wiseman come to the Salvation Army? Well, it's quite humorous, really. She was going down the street in her native town in Canada, and she passed the Salvation Army building. She'd hardly noticed it before, and she curiously went and looked in the windows. And inside the building, there was a Girl Scout program going on, Girl Guards, we would call. And she was looking at what was happening. And the leader of the Girl Guard troop, the local officer in charge of the girls, noticed this face against the window, and she went like this and drew the young girl, who was then about 12 or 13 years of age, inside the church. And the girl joined the Girl Guards. She became very quickly their leader. In fact, they discovered in this young woman such potential for leadership that when she was 15, she was made the guard captain herself, in charge of the total troop. And her leadership potential was exploited even at the age of 15. Now, as a local officer, one of your duties is to look around you constantly for young people in whom there already appears a modicum of this incredibly valuable quality we call leadership. And once you see it, it's your duty to encourage it all you can, to give training to those young people as much as possible, and then have the grace, and sometimes it takes a little grace, to stand back and let the young man, the young woman, take your place. Just a final word about leadership as a local officer. The good leader knows how to lead, but knows how to follow. He knows how to command, and he knows how to obey. As a local leader responsible for a group or a program in your corps, you will expect sometimes to have your orders obeyed literally and immediately. As a local leader, remember that to obey is not an undignified thing, and that as your leader, your corps commanding officer gives you instructions, you will demonstrate your rights to lead by your ability to follow, your rights to command by your enthusiasm to obey. There's no such thing as effortless leadership. If you're going to be a leader, a local leader, a local officer, and the name has tremendous dignity. In this Salvation Army that we love, you must expect that it will cost you trouble and time and effort to equip yourself for the task. But Paul, when writing to the Galatians, put it quite clearly when he said, if you are a leader, exert yourself to lead. And may God bless you as you do it.